Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order. Welcome to Herpanmo TV, and welcome once again to this little string of videos, which are the recordings of the Dreaming Saucers event. Now, this particular video is about Mark Devlin. Mark Devlin did a brilliant talk at Dreaming Saucers. Mark is a disc jockey, which is a profession renowned perhaps for its mainstream nature. So it's quite unusual to get someone in this particular field thinking the way Mark does. Now, Mark's research primarily is around mind control, and when it comes to mind control, we always talk about the media, the mind controlled by the media, and the part of the media which comes up more and more than any other within the idea that they're mind controlling us, that the powers that be are mind controlling us, is the music industry. And this is Mark's speciality. Mark has a lot of connections professionally with the music industry, of course, being a disc jockey. But he's really, I think, it's given him some insights that perhaps he wouldn't have had if he'd done some other kind of job. His book, do get his book. He's written 2 books now, I believe, and they were on sale at Dreaming Saucers, but of course you can buy them elsewhere. Definitely worth looking at. If you have any interest in mind control at all, please do pick them up. I think they're really, really good. And I hope you enjoy this show by Mark Devlin.
Well, thanks a lot, Ben. I've got to say, I do love the irony of an alternative conspiracy type event taking place in the establishment city of Oxford. Given that this place is the breeding ground for so many of the elite ruling class types who all attend Oxford University, everyone from Bill Clinton to Osama bin Laden, and everyone in between. So it's great that we have an event of this nature. I think it's the first of its kind in town, so props to Ben for putting it on. I was actually born in Oxford, and it was my birthday yesterday. So, thank you. A lot of people are surprised to learn that there are regular everyday folk that just happen to have been born in Oxford and live in these parts and aren't connected to academia in any way. And I'm very happy not to have attended university or anything like that myself. So, as Ben mentioned, I'm a DJ, a radio and club DJ, have been for many years. I've put out 2 volumes of my book, Musical Truth, which brings together everything I've come to understand about the true nature of the corporate music industry and the means for which it's really used. I'm going to be touching on some elements of that today, but Ben gave me a green light to do whatever kind of talk I wanted to for this event. So I decided it might be quite fun to take one of the chapters that I've got in the current book, which is all about lifetime actors, culture creation and social engineering, and expand it and put quite a bit of detail on it. So I'm titling this talk No More Heroes, and I'm not saying no more heroes as in, isn't it a shame that there are no more heroes like there used to be. I'm saying no more heroes as in we've got to stop giving away our power and genuflecting to these popular icons and these cultural figures that are served up to us, because we don't really know these people. We get to know the Wikipedia version of events, the official version of what they're supposed to be all about, their public image, but we don't really know who these people are, and we can get some clues as to what their true nature is when we start digging into their family connections and some of their affiliations and stuff like that. So this talk is going to be based all around that. I've built in a few gags because I do find that this kind of information, and the information that all the speakers here deal with, is so bloody ridiculous and absurd sometimes, or the reality that we're addressing is so absurd that if you don't have a laugh about it from time to time, you'll spend the whole day weeping uncontrollably in the corner. So feel free to laugh at appropriate points, but only appropriate points. So this guy knew a thing or two about how to cultivate value systems and perceptions in the minds of the general public. Edward Bernays, who was an Austrian Jew. He was the double nephew of the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and he was known as the father of PR, or propaganda. He basically invented the art form of formulating a public image for a group or an organisation or an individual. And he sure did do some work in his time. He worked with the American military at the time of both World Wars to get the American public to support the idea of the US being brought into World War I and World War II. He's also the guy that campaigned for fluoride to be placed in the water system in America when he was hired by an aluminium producing company, aluminum for our American friends, and they realised that they had this byproduct of the aluminium production process, and it was a chemical poison basically, didn't know what to do with it, hired Bernays, and he saw to it and made it happen so that fluoride was put into the water supply of the American public in conjunction with the Dental Association, who endorsed it by saying, oh, it's good for teeth, it prevents cavities and fillings. So that's the myth that we've lived with all these decades. He was responsible for that. He's also the guy that made sure Americans adopted eggs and bacon as part of their traditional breakfasts. He was hired by a food company to popularise the idea of eggs and bacon being a really protein, efficient and healthy way to start the day. He also popularised smoking among women in the American public, so he's got quite a lot to answer for. And did, I'm sure, in 1995 when he finally passed away at the age of 103. They didn't have chemtrails in those days, you see. So here's a famous quote from Bernays from his book Propaganda, which appeared in 1928, and it really sums up what we're talking about here, this whole dynamic. He said, "We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we've never heard of. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." We can also sum up this whole dynamic in just the great title of these 2 volumes of a book put out by Neil Sanders, who's a professional hypnotist and also an author and researcher. He put out this book called Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own. And this encapsulates the often held view that if people don't undergo any kind of higher-minded conscious awakening and attend events such as this and get alternative type information to the mainstream, you can spend an entire human lifetime under mind control where you actually don't have any original thoughts of your own, which have not been cultivated and fomented for you by the social engineers of this world. That's the dynamic that Bernays was talking about. And the unfortunate truth is there are large numbers of people in this world who fall into that category. Every thought they have, every value system, every belief, every prejudice has been formulated for them. So the first part is false heroes and role models. There's plenty of them. There was a KGB agent who became a defector, a whistleblower. His name was Yuri Bezmenov. And over the years, he's produced a number of lectures where he's talked about the subversion process that Russia has used on its political enemies going through the years. There are many different aspects to it. And he made the point that if you don't want a subversion tactic to be obvious to the target population, then there are various covert ways in which you can do it. And one of the most effective, he pointed out, was the creation of false heroes and role models. We've got a document here where he's detailing many of these subversion tactics that were used by Russia during the Cold War years. And you can see number 4 on the list here states culture, false heroes and role models, addictive fads, and mass trends, I think is supposed to be there as well. It's the cultivation of these fads, trends, movements, and the Pied Pipers, the leaders that are seen to be putting them into place. And a brilliant way to get an entire society, an entire nation to think the way you want them to and to adopt the belief systems that you want them to is to do it by way of false heroes and role models. People that are inserted into popular culture that the nation instinctively looks up to and listens to, and they trust them. And that's the big mistake, placing your trust in these people when you don't really know who they are. We can look at some examples of false heroes and role models. So Marcus Allen addressed this briefly this morning. The situation with Jim Morrison's dad, Jim Morrison of the Doors. So, as we heard, his father was the Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison, and he was the commander in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin non-incident false flag, which catapulted America into the Vietnam War. So how do you reconcile the fact that that's what Dad did, and at the very same time you've got Jim emerging as this larger-than-life, fully formed, iconic rock god who seemed to be anti-establishment, ostensibly anti-war, representing the angst of the young generation of those times? Well, the only way that you can reconcile these elements is when you understand that these people are inserted into popular culture and served up to us, rather than the public choosing its own heroes. We have these people given to us, and we can look at some of the reasons why they're selected for these roles. So there he is, this is Jim Morrison's dad. And we now know a little bit about his true nature. There's a great quote here from Joe Atwill, the author and researcher, and this is taken from one of the Unspun podcasts that he used to do with Jan Irving. Sadly, they've fallen out since. Insert face palm here. We won't go into the details, but these were great shows where they really took apart how culture creation works. And they did this one show where Joe was focusing on Jim Morrison and the Doors. I've included this quote because it really sums things up. So he says, Jim Morrison and the Doors. Now you've got the son of the Admiral who led a false flag fake attack in the Gulf of Tonkin that starts the Vietnam War. Who is this guy? He comes out of nowhere. He's very attractive and he has this appetite for LSD. Because he's a music idol, he influences people. But imagine if he'd come out and said, you know, I'm just the son of military intelligence and they've told me they want to have people take drugs, so please take drugs. Wouldn't really have worked. There are many, many examples of prominent musicians whose fathers were high-ranking military officers. This was detailed in Dave McGowan's brilliant work, his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And in Volume 1 of Musical Truth, I've got a whole chapter detailing this whole dynamic of these influential musicians, rock stars, band members that appear in the right place at the right time, influence culture in a very major way. And when you do some digging into the family backgrounds, you find that time and time again, the fathers were Navy admirals or generals, or they were connected to the Pentagon, the Defense Department. They came out of the intelligence services, CIA, FBI, MI5, MI6, so many examples. This is just one. Joni Mitchell, the celebrated folk singer, her father was a link trainer instructor for a flying instructor school coming out of Canada. And there is a very young Joni Mitchell in the arms of her father. As I say, just one of so many examples that you could select. And that whole Laurel Canyon scene coming out of Los Angeles in the counterculture years of the 60s, which Marcus mentioned this morning, is absolutely awash with family connections going back into the world of the military and the intel services. So you come to discover that all these musicians that we thought of as just coming out of nowhere and with these organic grassroots beginnings, it didn't work out quite that way. There's a little more to know about where they came from and why they are the famous ones that you've heard of and the others aren't. A few examples here coming out of the punk and new wave scene. So this is a multi-genre thing. It's not just psychedelic rock music. We find these family connections in all different genres of music. It goes into electronic dance music, it goes into hip-hop, into reggae, and I've got a whole chapter in the new book on punk and new wave, late 70s going into the 80s. Let's just look at one such example. There's the group Talking Heads, and there was a side project known as Tom Tom Club. Two of the members of both these groups were Tina Weymouth and Chris Frantz, who were a husband and wife couple. So if we look into the background of Tina Weymouth, we find her brother Jan, who was a Harvard graduate, turns out to have been chief of design on the Grand Louvre Pyramid in Paris, which involved the placement of the iconic glass pyramid on the top. Their father, in turn, Ralph Weymouth, was a Vice Admiral of the US Navy. There's another connection, a la Jim Morrison. Also a Master of the Freemason Grand Lodge of Maine. Their great-grandfather, Anatoly Labraz, known as the Bard of Brittany, married Mabel Davidson, the sister to Henry Pomeroy Davidson, bringing a link to Yale University and the secret society Skull and Bones. Won't be the first time we hear about them. Henry was also a senior partner of J.P. Morgan, the banking institution. He worked with the Astor Place Bank, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve System, including attending that notorious 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island. So that particular range of family connections does not disappoint. Another great one to throw into the mix here, just for your consideration, involves Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters, who was previously the drummer with Nirvana in the years before Kurt Cobain died in very strange circumstances in 1994. So Dave Grohl, if we do a bit of digging into where he came from, we find his father, James Harper Grohl, worked as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. So Robert's father, in turn, was William Howard Taft, who was the 27th President of the United States, and his father was Alfonso Taft, who was a founder of Skull and Bones. Here we go again. So I don't know about you, but when it comes to punk musicians, rock musicians, thinking of them playing these gigs in these gritty, grimy, sort of edgy venues, and thinking of the style of music, which is often very abrasive and very confrontational and very hardcore, I would imagine them to come from largely working class backgrounds. And I would have thought that when you look into who the dads were, you would find that they were unemployed maybe, in prison maybe, labourers, dockers, miners, lorry drivers, that kind of thing. But we don't find that. We find that the fathers were diplomats, politicians, MI5 CIA agents, connected to Harvard and Yale universities. All these kind of backgrounds that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find. Another family, which is a masterclass study in where all these bands come from, is the Copeland family. The patriarch was Miles Copeland Sr., and he was a legendary career CIA guy. For many decades, worked for the agency in various parts around the world. He had 3 sons, and he put them all to use in the music industry. You had Miles Copeland Jr., Ian Copeland, and this guy, who you might recognise as the drummer in the group The Police, Stuart Copeland. So the Copeland family had a stranglehold pretty much on the way the whole punk and new wave scene developed. So they managed many of the key bands. Miles Copeland Jr. had a TV show with the brand new MTV network, which he produced, and he would promote only his own bands. Only those bands that were on his roster would get airplay on this show. And if they didn't directly control any of these bands, then they had some hand in their publishing or their distribution. They had an umbrella company known as Copeland International Artists, initials being CIA. They also had another company falling under that called Frontier Booking International. There was another one called International Records Syndicate. And then of course we had the Police with Sting, as in Sting Operation. So it's not as if we weren't told what was going on there. The key to finding out why certain musicians are so successful and why they've made it and the next man hasn't, so often lies in who Dad was, what Dad did. Has anyone wondered why we've got Ed Bloody Sheeran absolutely everywhere and he's completely shoved down our throats the whole time? Why has he been selected to perform next weekend apparently at Harry Hewitt's, sorry, Prince Harry's wedding? Why is it Ed Sheeran and not anyone else? Why is he getting so much radio airplay? Well, we can look into who Dad is. So this is from John Sheeran's website. He's got his own biography up on there. And in the second paragraph, we learn that in 1998, John curated the official 50th birthday exhibition of the Prince of Wales at Hampton Court Palace. And further on, we learn that in 2000, he curated Our World in the year 2000, the United Nations Millennium Exhibition. So we now find that Ed Sheeran's dad has a connection to the royal family and to the United Nations, and that's why you've heard of Ed Sheeran. We can get into the genealogy as well. We've got a section on bloodlines coming up, but some of the relationships between famous people that you've heard of. And we're led to believe by the mainstream media, such as the Mirror here, when they report such things, that it's just an amazing coincidence. It's just one of those random things that just happens from time to time. And there's no plan here, there's no grand plot, you know, it's just the way things go. So Ed Sheeran turns out to be related to Gordon Burns, who you might remember as the host of the Krypton Factor back in the day. The connections just keep on coming as well, as we'll see. So we're talking about false heroes and role models, and here's an example of a couple here from two different worlds. The world of politics and the world of music. So we had this whole scene in the mid-90s that was known as Cool Britannia, the Britpop scene. And the idea was that Britain had become cool and trendy again, and we had this scene called Britpop involving primarily Oasis and Blur, plus all these other bands, and it was presented to us by the media as the most exciting time since the 60s, when you had the Beatles going up against the Rolling Stones, and Britain was cool again. In actual fact, the whole thing was an exercise in social engineering, and it was designed to win favour for Tony Blair and his new Labour Party, so that he could be ushered in as Prime Minister in the 1997 general election on the 1st of May, interestingly, which is a very significant date in the occult calendar. But anyway, we had this event at number 10, where musicians such as Noel Gallagher were lined up to be seen chatting with Tony and giving the impression that Tony was actually this cool guy. He was down with the kids, used to be in a band himself, played a bit of guitar, smoked a spliff or two, you know. So different from those stuffy old Tories, that grey old John Major, you know. We've turned a corner here, folks. So, you know, that's pretty much what it was all about. And it worked. So Labour got in, and lots of people who really should have known better fell for the hype that Tony Blair was some fresh, visionary, new kind of leader that the country really needed. But it's interesting that a few years ago you had this guy, Kevin Shields, who was a singer with the group My Bloody Valentine. And in an article published in the Guardian newspaper, he came out and said, oh, Britpop was a creation of government think tanks, basically, and it was designed specifically to popularise Tony Blair and New Labour and mind control the youthful generation of the time into adopting them. So very interesting that he came out with these comments, which I absolutely concur with. Not the sort of thing you're supposed to talk about, actually, when you're a musician, but very glad he did. And of course, here's Noel's brother, Liam, in a photo which he may possibly regret now. I hope he does. So the other big group, of course, besides Oasis, was Blur, and it was led by Damon Albarn. Damon Albarn, in interviews and public comments that he's given, has presented himself as someone who is a bit anti-establishment. He's spoken out against government austerity, he's spoken out against the homeless, he's made other sort of political comments like that. But unfortunately, a couple of years ago, in the Queen's New Year's Honours, he gleefully accepted an OBE. And I think this reveals a lot as well in terms of which individuals are awarded these apparent accolades, these apparent badges of honour. It'd be a bloody nightmare getting one of these in my book, but evidently many people are quite excited by them. So just the other week we had Ringo Starr eventually getting his knighthood, going to the palace. Notice how they always kneel in subjugation to the royals. They're on their knees as they receive these things. That is very symbolic. So Ringo may well have got his OBE many years earlier, I suppose, if he hadn't made songs like Back Off Boogaloo, which appears to be revealing the truth about the Paul McCartney situation, which I'm not going into in any great detail today because we want to be out here by about 5 o'clock, and it would take me till about November to cover it properly, so I'll gloss over that one. But here he is at the palace, flashing up the peace sign. And isn't that a strange thing when you really think about it? So OBEs, MBEs, knighthoods are awards given by the British Empire, or to represent people that have served the British Empire in some capacity or other. And here's Ringo flashing up the peace sign. Well, what does the British Empire really represent when you go back in history and when you're honest about it? It has been one of the most bloodthirsty, murderous institutions that humanity has ever seen, responsible for untold suffering and misery all around the world. In my book, that's not something to celebrate, and any kind of emblem or mascot of that institution is not something to be proud of. Maybe it's just me, but these celebrities don't seem to have a problem with it. I find it very ironic that they flash up the peace sign the whole time. This is highly symbolic, isn't it? Bono, if you're going to throw eggs and tomatoes, can you make sure it hits the screen this way, please? So here he is, flashing one eye, and evidently very proud of the award he's just got. We're going to find out some more about Bono. Nothing to see here, please move along. Yeah, exactly. Something that's very interesting to me is that recently we've seen a trend towards DJs picking up OBEs and MBEs. The whole theme of this talk and the chapter in the book is no more heroes and how you've got to let go of these role models that you've put up on a pedestal, and everyone has someone that they do that with. You know, it might be a Hollywood actor that you love, it might be a musician that you revere, it might be a political figure, it might be a consciousness guru. In my case, I always used to revere DJs because I used to be quite ambitious as a radio and club DJ. I wanted to be all I could be within those worlds. So I used to look up to guys like Pete Tong that we have here. Highly successful radio DJ. He's been on BBC Radio 1 for the past 27 years. And he's a multi-millionaire. You know, this guy has played the game and he's made a career of it. Absolutely one of the big movers and shakers in the dance music scene. So he picked up his MBE from William at the Palace in 2014. And this is a very strange thing for me to see DJs now getting these kind of accolades, because I'm old enough to remember when DJs were literally just blokes that played records. They'd be in pubs or community centres or clubs, and they'd just be these regular, anonymous geezers that played records. But something has happened over the course of the past 30 years to really shift people's perceptions of what a DJ represents. And we're going to get into that slightly more. But it's very interesting that we now have the likes of Pete Tong picking up OBEs. We've got Jazzy B of Soul to Soul, who's now an MBE. The DJ Norman J out of London, very big at Notting Hill Carnival, has picked up an MBE. David Rodigan, the reggae legend, is an MBE. And Goldie, the drum and bass pioneer, DJ and producer, at the Palace, picking up a knighthood. Who would have believed that this was going to happen? So he cultivates this image of being edgy and dangerous and anti-establishment, but only too happy to stand there in subjugation to Prince Charles and get his little emblem pinned on his jacket. This one's borrowed from David Icke, and just sums up the whole thing about sirs and lords. Don't know if you've noticed, but quite a large number of sirs and lords just happen to turn out to be paedophiles. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. I'm sure the Queen knew nothing about this when she knighted him. I'm sure she's very embarrassed to discover the truth, and I'm sure she'll be addressing it in her Christmas speech this year and apologising to the nation as to why she's knighted so many paedophiles. But it just seems to keep happening, doesn't it? So, Sir Jimmy Savile, Sir Edward Heath. I think we all know the true nature of these two. Lord Greville Janner, Sir Clement Freud, Lord McAlpine, Sir Cyril Smith, and so it goes on. So, in my book, knighthoods and sirs and lords are not really something to be proud of, not really something to cultivate. Gravitate towards. Alright, blame it on the bloodlines. All about genealogy, ancestry, the families from which these popular figures come. When we discover the bloodlines from which they emanate, we suddenly understand why they've been placed in these prominent culture influencing positions. And it's in all walks of life, like I say. It could be the the world of politics, it could be the world of whatever Kim Kardashian does. What does Kim Kardashian do? So she's famous for being famous. She's one of these people that everyone's heard of, but you don't really know what she actually does or what her skill is, right? Well, isn't it interesting when you come to find out that David Cameron is a 13th cousin of Kim Kardashian? And many of these stories have appeared in the mainstream media. So it's not just within the bounds of these batshit crazy tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy nutjobs like us, you know. These stories have appeared in the Daily Mail, the Guardian and such like. So for people that place stock in these types of titles, you know, they've got some stuff to come to terms with here. It's presented as just a coincidence that Cameron turns out to be cousins with Kim Kardashian. David Cameron and Boris Johnson are 8th cousins. Interestingly, you've got this fraternity within Oxford University just up the road called the Bullingdon Boys Club. And David Cameron, Boris Johnson and George Osborne were all members of the Bullingdon Boys Club. I guess it's Oxford University's take on Skull and Bones, in the same year. So they emerge out of this particular group. One of them goes on to be the British Prime Minister, one of them goes on to be the Mayor of London, and one of them goes on to be the Chancellor. But it's all just coincidence. And we live in a democracy, we're free to make our choice, to elect our leaders, and nothing's contrived, we're in control, right? We have the power, we have the say. That's the way it's presented to us. But when you realise where all these people come from, you come to understand that actually you don't have a choice at all. These people are served up to you. We had Prince Charles the other year talking very proudly about how he's descended from Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler of Transylvania. So what a weird story that was. Here we've got Prince Charles on the left and Vlad the Impaler on the right. sorry, that's wrong side. And I've thrown this one in because it's topical. You know, we've got the bloody fiasco of this wedding of the Hewitts going on next Saturday. You know, so I'm very happy that I'm doing a talk in Leicester next Saturday, which is far enough away from Windsor to keep me happy. I'm doing a presentation for Truth Juice in Leicester. I'll be away from all this bloody madness and ritual stuff because there'll be ritualistic elements to this, you can be sure. When you've got that number of people focusing their attention on one particular event, all that energy will not be going to waste. It will be steered off in desired directions. Couple of Prime Ministers' wives that are worth mentioning here. So we talked about Cameron, his wife was Samantha Cameron. This came up during research for a recent podcast that I did, and it concerns the Profumo Christine Keeler affair going back to 1963, subject of the movie Scandal. So one of the key figures in that whole story was Stephen Ward, the society osteopath who kind of was a fixer for various people in elite society. Let's just get the connection straight here. Mandy Rice Davis, who's one of the figures from that whole Profumo affair, she had it put to her that Bill Astle denied ever having been involved with her. She said, well, he would, wouldn't he? He died in 1966. His son William succeeded him as Viscount. In the 1970s, he married Annabelle Lucy Veronica Jones, and she had a daughter from the previous marriage, whose name was Samantha, who just happens to crop up in later years as the wife of British Prime Minister David Cameron. But don't worry, it's all random. It could have gone any possible way, and there's nothing to worry about. The other Prime Minister's wife worth mentioning is Sherry Blair, wife of Tony. It turns out that when you do the digging into her genealogy, she's actually descended from John Wilkes Booth. So her maiden name was Sherry Booth. Her father was the actor Tony Booth. And one of her ancestors was John Wilkes Booth, who is the guy that is said to have assassinated US President Abraham Lincoln back in, 1860. So several generations on, she pops up back in the public eye as the wife of a British Prime Minister. But it's all just random. As George Carlin said so succinctly, it's a big club and you ain't in it. So we're given the idea that we live in a democracy, we're free. This isn't a fascist dictatorship. We choose our leaders. And what a choice we get. So in the last US general election, we had Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton presented as the two candidates. Choice. You have choice. Do you really? Camera on, camera off. There you go. Of course, they all come from the same background, the same big club, and it's not really a choice at all. Here's a very telling picture from Bohemian Grove, the notorious meeting ground for so many of these elite types and the so-called great and good of the world. They all gather in this area of Redwood Forest in California every summer, connected to the Bohemian Club, secret society. This picture is from 1967, and you have Ronald Reagan sat on one side of the table and Richard Nixon on the other. Both these guys went on to become US presidents, and here they are attending the same meeting at the same time in 1967. Their careers were given to them and created for them. These people don't get there through hard work, crossing their fingers for good luck, and they certainly don't get there by random chance. Here's another example. In the 2000 general election, the two prime candidates were George Bush Jr. and John Kerry, and as you may be aware, both of them attended Skull and Bones out of Yale University in the same year, 1968. So the two candidates that the American public was offered under the guise of democracy and choice both came from the same secret society in the same year. Very reminiscent of what we had with the Bullingdon Boys Club and our British so-called leaders. Another one, while we're talking about bloodlines and families that just keep getting used generation after generation, that's worth mentioning, is the group The Tornadoes. We're going back to the early 1960s now. There was a super producer around in those times called Joe Meek, and the Tornadoes were one of his key groups. They had a big hit called Telstar. So one of the band members was a guy by the name of Rob Huxley. In his autobiography, he says he was amazed, he was astounded when he did a bit of digging into his genealogy, and he just happened to discover that he was a fourth cousin of Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, eugenicist, and co-architect of the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control program. And so his cousin just happens to pop up as the prominent member of one of these pop groups. But don't worry, none of it's planned. Culture creation and lifetime actors. Let's just put some more detail on certain aspects of this. So, a really good way of understanding how fads and trends and movements and social attitudes are cooked up for us, and most people fall for them hook, line and sinker, is to consider the counterculture hippie scene of the 1960s. This has been much documented in recent years, as well as the Dave McGowan book and all the great shows that Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill have done. There are many other researchers and authors that have really poured over the detail of this period and uncovered the massive degree to which this scene was directed by the CIA at pretty much every step of the way. So you have this consciousness guru, as he was presented, Dr. Timothy Leary, who very much popularised the use of LSD among young people in those very important years. The mantra of those times was turn on, tune in, drop out, which is actually a phrase that was gifted to Leary by Marshall McLuhan, who was an advertising executive from Madison Avenue. So that was a catchy kind of phrase that was used to sum up the attitude of those whole times. Tune in, as in tune into the frequency of LSD and all these other mind-altering drugs and the psychedelic rock music that was around at the time, and drop out, as in drop out of society, stop participating, don't undertake any kind of activism, just get high on drugs, listen to music, have free sex, and that was the social attitudes that were being cultivated in those times, and didn't they do a good job of it? If you want to get an insight into the mindset of the people that actually put this stuff into play, the social engineers, you can catch a video on YouTube called MK-Ultra Reunion Party. This is from 1979, and you get Timothy Leary and a bunch of his associates sitting around in this private residence, basically patting each other on the back for a job well done. They're gloating over the way they changed societal attitudes back in the 60s. Most of the individuals in this video speak with, you know, a very clipped, sort of plum-in-mouth British public school accent. So they're all coming out of Oxford and Cambridge and Tavistock Institute and organisations such as that. And they're rubbing shoulders with the likes of Leary, all talking about what a good job they did in making sure that whole scene went the way it did. Well worth absorbing if you want to get some background detail into how all this gets done. A contemporary of Timothy Leary was this guy, Robert Gordon Warson, who worked for JP Morgan Bank. So he was like a propaganda PR guy for JP Morgan. But one of his extracurricular activities involved going down to Mexico in 1957 and seemingly hanging out with a bunch of shamanic sort of tribes and different cultures down there in Central America, and getting used to how psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, were used in ritual ceremonies. He then came back to America and popularised the whole idea of magic mushrooms being used as a recreational psychedelic drug to go alongside LSD to change people's consciousness. And mushrooms came to be adopted as part of the whole counterculture, the whole hippie scene, sitting there alongside these other psychedelics. There was a big Life magazine article in 1957 detailing his findings. Well, it turns out that trip down to Mexico, as uncovered by Jan Irvin on Unspun, was funded by the CIA. And there's a document which is now available for all to view online, which is the pay requisition of Warson from the CIA, which proves that that trip was funded by the agency. So suddenly it stops being a sincere individual on a mission to change the consciousness of young people because he believes in it, and it becomes a military-grade exercise in intelligence services social engineering. And we have the documentation to show that. Another one, another guru of those times, would be Terence McKenna, who's another individual that spoke about entheogens and psychedelics and what a wonderful thing they were, plant medicines, in terms of putting us in touch with our true nature and raising our consciousness. Well, there's some interesting things to consider about McKenna. First of all, he did a series of lectures in London under the brand name of Evolution in 1992. And he was linking the burgeoning acid house British dance music scene with these tribal cultures and the use of things like mushrooms and other plant medicines. So in his quotes here, he says, "With electronic culture, you can create shamans for the global planetary village. And this, to my mind, is the function that rock and roll played in the 60s and house music should play in the 90s. He goes on to talk about house music and rave culture, physiologically compatible rhythms, sound can change neurological states in large groups of people getting together, creating a telepathic community that would be strong enough to carry out into the mainstream of society." I've got 2 massive chapters in the new book, and I've done many talks on how the acid house scene came out of the UK 30 years ago, which gave way to the massive worldwide electronic dance music scene we have now, affecting millions of young people all around the world, shows hallmarks of having interference from agencies like Tavistock, MI5, MI6 and such. And it also shows signs of being very much linked to what was done earlier with that 60s counterculture scene over in America. So it's very interesting that McKenna in these comments seems to be making a connection himself between that 60s scene and the 90s scene, and he's bringing in aspects such as how sound frequencies can change the hive mind state of large groups of people, particularly when they're under the influence of mind-changing drugs. Another quote from McKenna that's worth bearing in mind is this one that he made at the Esalen Institute, very much linked to mind control research in California in 1994. So he said, "Certainly when I reached La Chorrera in 1971, I had a price on my head by the FBI. No, he actually named the agency. I was running out of money, I was at the end of my rope, and they said, you know, with a mouth like yours, there's a place for you in our organisation. And I've worked in deep background positions, about which the less said the better. Then about 15 years ago they shifted me into public relations, and I've been there to the present. That seems to be a direct admission straight from the horse's mouth that, at least for a period, he was doing work on behalf of the FBI. So suddenly you have yet another cultural hero that's been put up on a pedestal by so many, who, by his own admission, has links to one of these agencies. So is he really who you thought he was? Another great quote that I've included here from Jan Irvin, because it really sums up what we're talking about here, and how when you get access to this kind of information, you have the opportunity to break the mind control if you choose to go with it, if you choose to make that free will decision. So he said, 10 years ago, I released 70 hours of Terence McKenna audio to the internet. Now in hindsight, I'm looking at all of his research and everything and going, my God, look what he was into. So it's my duty, having discovered that I was mind controlled myself, to put this information out there to help others. And they may hate me for it in the interim, and trust me, researchers like us get a lot of hate when you start mentioning certain names that people just don't want to hear. But I think the people who would take the time to actually read the information and look at it closely will find it very liberating, because it's much easier to spend a few hours or days or weeks researching facts than it is to spend a lifetime believing lies. I concur entirely with that, and that's why I do the work that I do, despite the number of haters that it brings. So that whole 60s scene, you had Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters, who was also an asset of the CIA, the Grateful Dead, who were very much the poster children group of that generation, who have very heavy ties to the CIA, also ties to Bohemian Grove, and the road manager of the Grateful Dead for a period, well, one of their road managers was Hank Harrison, who's the father of Courtney Love. There's also connections going back to the CIA there. But another road manager for a time was Alan Trist, who was the son of Eric Trist, who was one of the founder members of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, this think tank that's all about social manipulation and mind control. But don't worry, the Grateful Dead were just a bunch of hippie stoners that were on our side. Then we can look at Gloria Steinem. In hand with all these other social changes in the 1960s, we had the birth of the feminist movement, Ms. magazine and all that stuff, and Gloria Steinem was the figurehead, the Pied Piper for that whole scene, all about getting women out of the home and into the workplace, and presenting the idea that you can be the equal of your male counterparts. You don't have to be at home looking after the kids, you could be out there in the world of work and you can have a career as well. Well, it's very convenient for the IRS, of course, because now you've got a whole new group of society contributing taxes, but it's also breaking up the traditional family unit. It's doing just that, getting women out of their nurturing roles in the home, getting them away from their kids, getting the kids put into daycare under the supervision of the state, and getting women out into the world of work. That's what that whole scene was really all about. It was presented under the guise of empowering females, but we can understand the social engineering aspects of it when we realise that Gloria Steinem was a CIA asset and was on the payroll of the agency. So I mentioned the acid house scene, how that got going in the UK at the tail end of '87 and all through '88. It was known as the second summer of love. As I mentioned, I've done other presentations where I go into very fine detail about how this whole scene went off, but there were many parallels between the 80s scene and what had gone before in America in the 1960s. We can see little clues like this on this flyer for one of the early acid house nights known as Spectrum, the Theatre of Madness, headed up by Paul Oakenfold, very key DJ figure. We've got a phrase on the flyer which says, "Have you passed the acid test?" And acid was slang for LSD in the 60s, and in the 80s UK scene, acid came to be a slang term for ecstasy, MDMA, which was the drug of choice of that particular scene. So in the 1960s, you had psychedelic rock music, LSD, and all these gatherings, these hippie communes gatherings, music festivals and such. In 1987, going forward into the 90s in the UK, you had electronic dance music replacing psychedelic rock, ecstasy replacing LSD, and all these big raves and festivals replacing the hippie festivals that had gone before. Basically the same template, the same master plan being rolled out 21 years later on the opposite side of the Atlantic. The details are slightly different, but the overall strategy is the same. We'll skip past that one because it's a bit wordy. Basically pointing out that all these culture creation, socially manipulating programs come out of one of these institutions, such as the Tavistock Institute, the Frankfurt School, the Fabian Society, and all these other different organisations. So it's my considered opinion that the acid house scene and everything that it led to, the birth of the UK superclubs, the rave and festival and free party scene of the 1990s, was all building up long term to what we have right now in 2018. This massive electronic dance music scene all around the world, these festivals attended by tens or hundreds of thousands of people at very large venues, sports arenas, stadiums, big fields, and what it's actually being used for is to glamorise and popularise the idea of the transhumanist AI future, which is not really the future at all because we're already in it. Although there are plans to take it much further. But this smart grid society, the Internet of Things, this reverence for digital and technological ways of doing things, what this scene is being used for is to entrain an entire generation of young people to be accepting of the way the future is going to turn out, where everything's going to be digital, everything's going to be linked, everything's going to be smart. And we can see this in the themes of these big festivals. We can consider the combined effect of electronic dance music, which is digital in nature and is all about sound frequencies. When you're at one of these large events and you're pooling your consciousness with all the other people that are in attendance in a hive mind, collective consciousness kind of way, most of these people are going to be under the influence of mind-altering drugs because the E is still everywhere. And you've got this potentially lethal combination when it comes to mind control. Drugs, the collective hive mind state, and sound frequencies, beaming subliminals into the subconscious mind of all these people. And just look at some of the names of the very biggest electronic dance music events that we have all over the world now. And you can start to see some themes emerging. Dream State in California, Trance Nation, Velvet Hypnotized, Atlantis, Spring Awakening, Awakening Fridays. Not the kind of awakening we talk about in these meetings. I would suggest it's an awakening on some social manipulators' terms, not on an individual's terms. Dream Beach, Delirium Eternity, Electronic Family, Digital Society, Digital Dreams, Tomorrow World, Tomorrowland, Future Music Festival, and New Horizons. It's all conjuring up images of this digital, electronic future world. Tomorrow World, Tomorrowland. This is what we're being headed towards. So the programming is right there in these titles. And look at the geographical spread of these events. So they range from Australia to Belgium to Argentina, literally all over the world. This is a worldwide agenda. And all these events are going off in tandem with each other. Some of the imagery that we get at these events: Digital Society, happening at the end of this month in Leeds. Pretty much sums it all up. And the role of the DJ, as I mentioned, has changed from some bloke spinning records and doing Miss Wet T-shirt contest in some function room of some grimy pub, a bit like this one probably, to what we now have, the likes of David Guetta, who is up there at a DJ booth which kind of resembles a religious altar, and he's got a throng of 10,000 people, this congregation, like the mass of a church, gathered beneath him. And all he's got to do is put his hands up like that, and he's commanding and controlling the consciousness of 10,000 people in front of him. He'll put his hands up like that, and the entire crowd will scream. He can start clapping his hands like that, and 10,000 people will clap along with him. That's the incredible control that these guys now have over massive numbers of people. So they're not going to allow just anyone to get into these kind of influential positions. You can't just rise up through the ranks through hard work and crossing your fingers for good luck. These people are selected for these roles. They're the chosen ones. And that's why there's such a gulf now between the very biggest DJs and how popular they are and how much they earn and everybody else, as any other hard-working DJ will tell you. Another figure from that whole scene who is very influential, has been for a number of years, is the German DJ producer, Paul van Dyk. And it becomes very interesting to look at the symbol, the sigil, which he's rocked as his main logo for quite a number of years. So it's this interesting triangular design. And people really do put these dance music producers and DJs up on pedestals and revere them as gods. Here's someone with a transfer of this guy's logo on his back. And I bet he doesn't understand what this sigil is and what the energy of it represents, but because he reveres this individual so much, he's got a transfer of it. And when you go on these people's Facebook pages, you read comments, literally, like, "You are my God, I worship you, I hang on your every word, I've named my firstborn child after you." That's the level of worship that people have for these dance music gods. So let me just fast forward to that logo, because just wanted to go into this. When you invert the Paul van Dyk logo, it becomes this. And during the course of my research, I came across this logo, which was used by British military intelligence, MI5, between the 1950s and the 1970s. And you'll notice there are quite a few similarities between the two. It doesn't end there either. There's an American-Japanese DJ producer by the name of Steve Aoki, and on this flyer for one of his events, he's using what appears to be a very similar sigil, complete with the capstone and the all-seeing eye in it, and rays of illumination all around. Is that going to be just a coincidence, or is that going to be a little clue and a little indicator for those with the eyes to see as to what these people are really all about? A section on extracurricular activities. So with these lifetime actors, they're presented to us as one thing or the other. So we think of them as a politician, as an actor, as a musician, as a business leader. But often you find they undertake activities that are very different to those for which they're known. So we can look at Bill Gates. And everyone thinks, oh, Bill Gates, he's just that nerdy computer guy, isn't he? He's the guy that invented Microsoft. Well, actually, he's a eugenicist. And his father, William Gates Sr., was one of the prominent founding members of Planned Parenthood, which is all about population reduction, and they make no bones about it. So here's a quote from Bill Gates, which gives a little insight into his real mindset. And that just about sums it all up, doesn't it? Many other examples. I'll have to skim through a whole load of these because I've got 107 slides on here. About 5 minutes to do it in. Bono, I think we know what he's all about. You can judge a man by the company he keeps, and that's Bono's true nature. Is he really just a rock singer, or is he a little bit more than that, judging by who he hangs out with and what he gets up to in his spare time?
Mark, you can go over time a little bit if you want, alright?
Alright, I appreciate that, yeah. I'll wrap it up as soon as I can. That's one of the gags, by the way. Arnold Schwarzenegger, this is a surprising one for many. You look at the sort of people he hangs out with and it's very similar to Bono's motley crew. And you think, well, Arnold Schwarzenegger's just a bodybuilder, isn't he? And an actor. Well, is he? Or is he a little bit more than that? If you're just a bodybuilder from Austria, do you get to hang out with these types of people? This is quite telling. This was Arnold Schwarzenegger winning his first bodybuilding competition in 1967 in London. Look who's presenting the prize. And look at the handshake. It is simple, yeah. A little bit more to know about Arnie than we might first think, I would suggest. Paul McCartney, or is it? So it seems that lifetime actors never get to retire, and when they're called upon for some extracurricular duty or other, they have to step to it. It's like these Hollywood movies that you see, and there's a cliche of a retired or supposedly retired CIA agent. And you know, he's been enjoying retirement for the last 20 years, and he goes fishing and hangs out with his grandkids. And one day the phone goes, and they're calling him back in. And he says something like, "Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. One last mission." And I think that's what they do with these celebs. When they're required to endorse a particular campaign or other that's going to serve some agenda or other, they have to step to it. So we have Paul McCartney, whoever he may be, propping up this March for Our Lives anti-gun rally campaign in New York the other week. As I said, I could get into the whole Paul is dead thing. Suffice to say, for the purposes of this conversation, I will just say there has been more than one Paul McCartney. I won't go any further into detail, but there is a lot more to know. And that's really all I'm going to say on that. Vegetarian activist, worked in an abattoir. It's a good match, isn't it? And please spare a thought for the homeless and destitute this week. Please spare whatever you can. So we're talking about Bob Geldof. You know, he's thought of as the scruffy, out-of-tune lead singer for the Boomtown Rats. That's what he is, isn't he? And the guy that did Live Aid and Band Aid. But recently he was wheeled out as the public face of smart meters. So he's up there saying to everyone, oh, smart meters are the future and everyone needs to get one and it's the efficient way to do things. It just smacks of this individual being completely controlled by those that tell him what to do. And when he's required to head up some campaign or other, they wheel him out. He says his piece and then they wheel him off again. And we see this time and time again with these celebrities. Richard Curtis, no time to really get into him. This crew that are wheeled out for comic relief every year. We're getting into the BBC. I've got a whole section here on the BBC, which I don't really have too much time for, but it's bringing in Savile. It's bringing in the BBC's Children in Need campaign. So there's Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris, and Gary Glitter, who are just the three that you'd want to be the mascots and the emblems of children in need, really, isn't it? Imploring people to help these poor kids that are in needy situations. Just the three that you would want served up to you by the corporation. Well, in this case, it's all about mockery and, quite frankly, taking the piss out of the general public, most of whom are entirely clueless and know no better. A few final examples. Okay, catching up with myself here. Russell Brand. I really hope that nobody in the room still falls for Russell Brand's People's Revolutionary Act, and we need a more egalitarian society and all this bullshit that he came out with on Newsnight, Question Time and stuff. You don't get to go on those programmes on the BBC unless you're serving some agenda, unless you're some kind of asset, unless it's part of the narrative. Excuse me. And there's so much to know about Russell Brand, from his cropping up married to Katy Perry and, to all intents and purposes, showing the hallmarks of being her mind control handler, to this kind of stuff that he came out with a couple of years ago, where he announced the birth of his first child and he said he was going to raise the child gender neutral. Right on cue, in tandem with this whole transgender modification of societal attitudes that's going on. Just a couple of little extra pictures here to bear in mind when it comes to whether Russell Brand is a good role model for people to look up to, and you know, whether he's really a man of the people that's out to represent their interests. That's what Russell Brand is all about. In line with this whole gender-neutral, non-binary, social engineering think tank BS that we now have being dished up to us, we had the grime artist Skepta at an awards do, I think this was last year. And grime is kind of like an offshoot of British hip-hop. It's always been seen as very edgy, very kind of dark and dangerous. And the male artists have always rocked a very heterosexual alpha male kind of image. So at this awards do last year, you had Skepta turning up in women's knitwear. And the interviewer says, Skep, what's all this? And he says, oh, I'm gender fluid now, I'm dressing gender fluid. Now, is that going to be a conscious, personal decision made on an individual basis by this guy? He wakes up one morning and says, do you know, I'm going to go to this awards do in my mum's jumper today because I'm feeling gender fluid. Or is it more likely that he's acting under instruction from those that tell him what to do, social engineers, in line, in tandem with other changes that are taking place in society to entrain people to think a certain way and to accept transgenderism, non-binary, gender fluidity, whatever you call it, as the new thing that you have to adopt, a new social attitude that you have to be down with, otherwise you're branded as a beast and a bigot. Then we have an example from the hip-hop world of an artist called Young Thug. I'm not even joking. His artist name is Young Thug, and here he is, dressed up as Little Bo Peep. And this is part of a very far-reaching agenda to homosexualise and emasculate black males in hip-hop. This is a deep one. I'll go into it some more in the book. But there's a very far-reaching agenda. So if it was just one artist coming out like this, someone might try and make the case for, oh, he's just expressing himself individually. But it's not just one artist. Many artists from this scene now are rocking this kind of image. They're wearing women's clothing on stage, and very clearly it's part of an agenda to change people's perceptions, change people's value systems. That's how social engineering works. That's what lifetime actors and Pied Pipers are used for. And unfortunately, even in this scene, the truth scene, as we think of it, there are certain individuals that I've had to question in recent years, very reluctantly. I'm not going to name names because I can't be 100% certain of it. And I don't want to make a statement if I'm not 100%. But there's, a couple of people who I used to follow, I used to look up to. Now I've got some questions about them. So if social engineering and culture creation is working everywhere else in society, I guess we need to expect that in this truth scene or movement, we're going to have some aspects of it there that we need to look out for as well. Wrapping up then, this is a piece of the last chapter of my book, which I think sums up everything that I've spoken about. When you learn about how lifetime actors and cultural creation work, the question becomes, are you happy you were duped and taken into confidence by these people? And would you like more of it? Or are you rather hacked off that you were treated as such easy fodder, rife for manipulation? And now that you understand how the game is played, do you resolve to never be fooled in the same way again? There's no shame in admitting you were bamboozled. All of us are from the earliest age. The dignity comes from acknowledging that it happened and knowing better for next time. So, no more heroes is the key. Just realise that we're our own heroes and we don't need to externalise our power to people that are dished up to us who we don't really know. We don't see these people when the camera gets turned off. We don't see what they get up to when they walk off stage. But we know what we're all about. We can know that we're genuine. We can know that we're worth putting our trust into. We can know that we're the real deal in a way that we can't know about anyone else. This is all that's left for me to say, and I want to thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark Devlin. That was excellent. I know Mark had a lot more you wanted to say. I'm sorry you didn't have time to say everything you wanted to say, but do check out Mark's book. He's over there. Get a copy. He'll sign it for you. He's got to go soon, so get one now. Okay. And could you please be back here for half an hour? In half an hour's time, we will continue. Now, there's some more merchandise on the other table there where Tina is. Right. Go and enjoy yourselves, and see you back here.
This joke doesn't work in America.
Oh, yes. So you've got the glasses. Yeah. The glasses. Oh, yeah.